Hello, my name is Rebecca Morgan, and I did my research on plant-based diets and their effect on cardiovascular health. So, from the study that I chose, the research question was, does a plant-based diet stand out for its favorable composition for heart health? And dietary intake data from a randomized controlled trial. So the objective and the main purpose from the study was to investigate whether a plant-based diet has a particularly beneficial composition for heart health compared to other dietary patterns such as the omnivore diet. The authors analyzed dietary intake from a randomized control trial and the nutritional profile of the plant-based diets that the participants were on were analyzed for its potential impact on heart health. So why is this important? So cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death globally, according to WHO. It surpasses other infectious diseases and cancer, and it takes more than 17.9 million deaths each year. It places a huge burden on healthcare systems. Treating CVD is very expensive and greatly affects healthcare budgets. This is mainly due to like medical care and hospitalization, surgeries, medications, and then like rehabilitation services. Um, it also greatly affects quality of life. Many people who have increased risks of cardiovascular disease will experience symptoms such as chest pain, fatigue, shortness of breath, reduced physical function, and strength. And then when it goes untreated or poorly managed, it can lead to heart failure, stroke, peripheral artery disease, and even death. So, with the biological background, genetic predispositions make people more likely to develop cardiovascular disease. This is primarily due to how their body metabolizes cholesterol and fat and how it regulates blood sugar levels and blood pressure levels. So like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, hyperlipidemia, diabetes, and obesity are all symptoms that may surmount from genetic factors and mutations. Also, with mutations in specific genes can cause hyperlipidemia, and it affects the lipid metabolism, which can cause like elevated LDL cholesterol, which is going to increase the risk for coronary artery disease and arteriosclerosis, which can also onset from the body's inflammatory and immune response from genetic mutations. Other factors can include like environmental factors, so toxins, pollutants in the air, and infectious agents, as well as lifestyle factors such as diet, exercise, and smoking. So with like diet, it's foods high in saturated fat, very sedentary lifestyle, and then the use of tobacco smoking. In the US specifically, most Americans live a very sedentary life, and a lot of fast food is regularly consumed. I know that 1 in 3 Americans get fast food daily, so it's a big contributing factor to cardiovascular disease. And then with the physiological backgrounds, some of the because the progression of CVD can be caused by other factors such as hypertension, dyslipidemia, insulin resistance, and endothelial dysfunction. So when you have any of those, that can lead to that heart failure and heart disease. And some of those factors could be caused by chronic stress, which can lead to like elevated blood pressure for a long period of time, which is not good for your arteries. That can lead to its dysfunction, poor sleeping habits, and then hormonal imbalances. So it's important to like manage your stress, make sure you're sleeping enough. And then the cardiovascular disease pertaining to nutrition. So as I mentioned before, poor dietary habits really increase your risk for cardiovascular disease, as well as like obesity, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and diabetes is associated greatly with added sugar and processed foods in the American diet. And on the flip side of things, diets high in vegetables, fruits, and whole grains, lean proteins, and healthy fats can help to minimize the risks, but we don't see a lot of consumption of those foods. So with this research article, there's a few medical terminology that I was going to go over. So cardiovascular is referring to the system in the body that's responsible for circulating blood, delivering oxygen and nutrients, while also removing waste and other byproducts. And then cardiovascular disease is kind of like a cluster of conditions, and it can refer to multiple conditions, as I previously mentioned, that are affecting the heart and the blood vessels. And then cardiometabolic risks are the combination of risk factors that predispose a person to have cardiovascular disease and other metabolic disorders. And then atherosclerosis is the buildup of plaque in the inner walls of the arteries, which can increase the symptoms. And then also within this research study, they talk about SPPS, which is the statistical package for social sciences. This is so for the methods of this research article, it was a randomized controlled trial with two main groups of participants. One was the control group who ate a regular omnivorous diet, and then the experimental group was the plant-based diets. The randomization ensures that there's no bias within the research study and allows for the groups to be compared at baseline. The study consisted of 37 participants. It started at 70, but with limitations, they only ended with 37. 18 of the participants were in the plant-based group and 19 were in the control group. So the plant-based diet group was instructed to eat whole plant-based foods, while the control group was just to eat how they normally did with their omnivorous diet. And then nutrition counseling was provided to the plant-based diet group to help them adopt and adapt to a healthy plant-based diet. So this is like, just because it's plant-based doesn't always mean it's healthy. Like, especially today, a lot of like packaged food that's plant-based is a lot of processed foods. So these counselors help them really try to eat whole foods, not processed plant-based foods. And then dietary intake was assessed using a 3-day weighed food record at baseline and after 8 weeks. And then nutritional analysis was performed using specialized software, which was the SPPS. Anthropometric measurements and laboratory tests were measured at baseline, and then again after 8 weeks. The lab tests mainly focused on blood sugar and lipid levels, and it was used, the statistical analysis was used using the SPPS and Excel. So the results and the key findings, the researchers found that participants in the plant-based diet group consumed fewer calories compared to the control, which they believed was because of the lower energy density found in plant-based foods, and this could lead to potential weight loss, which is a treatment for most cardiovascular diseases. They also showed that they consumed a higher amount of dietary fiber, and fiber is super important for cardiovascular health because it can help reduce your risk. And with that, they all met the minimum of 30 grams per day, which is pretty good for the standard American diet. They also consumed less saturated fatty acids as well as cholesterol and salt compared to the control group. But one thing to note was that the plant-based diet consumes slightly less protein than recommended, so it would be important to monitor that. And participants in the plant-based diet had an increased concern for critical micronutrients such as vitamin B12, riboflavin, vitamin D, pantothenic acid, iodine, and calcium, and then iron and zinc. The one thing with iron and zinc is they still met the recommended intake for iron and zinc, but it was just less than what they originally had at baseline 8 weeks prior to starting the study. So the data revealed that participants following a whole food plant-based diet exhibited a more favorable nutrient composition for cardiovascular health compared to those following an omnivorous diet. Currently, cardiovascular disease is usually treated through diets such as like the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet. Both of those diets are high in fruits and vegetables. They have an emphasis on like whole grains, low intake of fat, salt, cholesterol, and dairy products. And then they have a moderate intake of lean proteins, specifically like fish rather than red meats. But plant-based diet is very similar to those diets where they have a big emphasis on whole foods that are high in fiber because we know fiber is so good for reducing cardiovascular risk. And so it could be a helpful tool in treating heart disease, but it's important, however, to pay attention to the patient's nutritional profile so they don't become deficient in any essential micronutrient or consume less protein than what is recommended. So the researchers in this study suggested that supplementation might be a tool to mitigate the issue of potential deficiencies. There were a few limitations from this research study. So the first one was that there was a limited sample size. As I had previously mentioned, they started with 70 participants, but by the time the sample was reduced, it was down to only 37 participants. And this was primarily due from participants having incomplete dietary records, and some just didn't follow through with the protocol. Then this limits the statistical power and reliability of the data. So one thing that they could improve on the future is just increasing your sample size, and smaller sample sizes make it more difficult to detect smaller differences between the two groups. And then one kind of unique challenge that they faced was this took place during the pandemic, and it kind of happened like right in the middle. So they had to switch from face-to-face instruction from their nutritional coaches to an online session. And the researchers believe that that may have reduced the effectiveness of the education and instruction with their interaction of their participants, and then would have lowered their adherence to the plant-based diet. So obviously, you would have to redo the study when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. And then dietary reporting, there may be bias in this, in that participants felt inclined to underestimate what they perceived as like unhealthy foods, so like sweets, alcohol, processed foods, and then overestimate like nutritious foods like fruits and vegetables. And then dietary assessments, they did implement the 3-day weighed food records, which is like the gold standard for dietary assessments, but it still left room for bias. And then the blood test, they only revealed like blood pressure, and they wanted more information dealing with like nutrient deficiencies as well as the absorption to give them a better idea of their blood lipid profile. So overall, this study implicated that adopting a plant-based diet may lead to improvements in various cardiovascular risks, such as body weight, BMI, waist circumference, fasting HbA1c, and fasting blood glucose. It highlights the changes in nutrient profiles and associated with plant-based diets. Changes including lower energy density, reduced intake of cholesterol and saturated fat, and an increased consumption of fiber, which is all consistent with the current recommendations for cardiovascular health. And other potential concerns from the study was regarding the nutrient adequacy, so how patients were more susceptible to be deficient in vitamin B12 and vitamin D on the plant-based diet. So moving forward, that would be something to monitor with a patient or a client who's on a plant-based diet. All right, lastly, for the application to nutritional practice, This may be beneficial in preventing and managing cardiovascular disease. Dietitians should educate their patients about the potential health benefits of a plant-based diet and give them guidance on how to adopt this new dietary pattern if they wish to do so. So they shouldn't force this dietary pattern on someone who is not going to be able to adhere to it. It's not going to be helpful if they can't stick to it and then end up completely going off the rails on a different diet. And educating them on how to have a plant-based diet will be very important so they know that they can stick to their protocol. And then dietitians should make dietary recommendations to meet the specific needs and preferences of their patient and client. So if a patient's like already low in B12, iron, calcium, this may not be the best diet for them because that makes them more susceptible to having that deficiency. And then they should closely monitor the nutritional profile, again with those deficiencies, to avoid any complications. So say a patient did start a plant-based diet, but they weren't meeting the nutritional profile recommendations, the dietitian would need to adjust their protocol to benefit their health the most. And these are my references, and this was my study about plant-based diets.